So as the main tenet, or one of the main tenets in non-dual tantric teachings, states that individual is cosmic. By that, the real meaning of that is that cosmos is an expression of consciousness. So therefore, individual being is nothing other than compact mass of consciousness, where all laws of nature are encompassed, encapsulated in this human being. But these lofty, if you will, concepts, of course, may not be easy to contemplate because of the conditioning. So we will speak now to that what here understood to be as one of the main cause of why we do not experience that what is our essential nature. Because our essential nature is the self, undivided, forever pure, shines in all circumstances, in all conditions, as the self, and nothing other than the self. So although our essence, the essence of our soul, or who we are, in reality is nothing other than Shiva, right? Shiva, as has been introduced in last night's darshan, that pure awareness. Our experience is limited, and that, as it were, Shivahood is somehow eclipsed. The main reason why the essential nature of reality is eclipsed is understood to be on the account of a thought construct taking hold. A thought construct is a term which in Sanskrit known as Vikalpa, and many of you who have studied various spiritual traditions and read certain books, you may have come across of that term, Vikalpa. Vikalpa is simply that, thought construct. And if you read some of the discourses by very famous teachers who very often being spoken as the originators of that non-duality, Ramana Maharshi, then Ramana Maharshi constantly brought the attention to, up until there is this frequency of Vikalpa, until Vikalpa is there active, then Brahman is eclipsed. In other words, Vikalpa is the cult print. Vikalpa, the thought construct, is what abstracts consciousness from itself and gives rise to this identification with the limited being. Although our essence is unlimited and it shines in all circumstances, in fact, it illumines even the state of ignorance. It is eclipsed by a thought construct. So, whichever way we may try, there is no way out of what is known as disillusion, or if you want, distraction, disillusion, less dramatic, of the Vikalpa. Up until Vikalpa dominates our awareness is abstracted. Simple. It's very simple. Soon as Vikalpa settles down, the consciousness shines forth. This is yoga. This is directly experienced and known. It's known to everyone. It's known to every one of you. Absolutely every one of us. It's not something that is known only to so-called enlightened and not known to the ignorant. It is known to everyone because this is also a natural, if you will, condition. It's a natural condition. But because the dominance of our activity and identification already took place with the body-mind, then that identity is reinforced and also constantly being in check by the very act of mental activity. Therefore, even culturally, we are not comfortable being thought-free. We, as it were, forgot what it is like to be in a thought-free state. It's not cultured, you see? Thought-free state is daydreaming of catching flies with mouth open or something, you know? You have to be occupied. Think, occupy, concentrate. Don't you dare. What are you doing relaxing here? So, just be on top of it. And this comes essentially, eventually at a price. And the price, of course, is the heaviest price we pay, because this then thought construct takes over, and all there is a thought construct. So when we speak of the abstraction of consciousness, the only thing that there is as an active agent, right? Again, this is spoken with the limitation of the language, is that what is known as Vikalpa, a thought construct. So, spiritual practice addresses this at some point, either at the very beginning, somewhere halfway through, or at some point more in the advanced, mature stages of how to deal with Vikalpas. And then, of course, this will be pertinent to certain traditions and certain methodologies that were birthed in this or that tradition, of how to work with Vikalpas and how to dissolve these Vikalpas, because these Vikalpas, up until they are active, they will do what they do best: abstract our consciousness. Very simple. As simple as this sounds, of course, this is also known as the final frontier. It is good to understand it from the start, but it's also known as the final frontier because the thought construct is all we know about ourselves. Again, just ponder for a moment. Ponder for a moment and please make that connection. Thought construct here literally means everything that we know about ourselves. How can that be otherwise? So in other words, it's like spiritual process is going against one's own self. Do you see that? If we're giving that spin here. This is what Christ meant. I did not come here with, like pussyfooting. Read some of the more outstanding revelations, right? Some of lesser known good news, right, as they're known. If you translate this from the Hebrew, it's a good news, right? What's the actual term? From Mark, from Peter, yes, Gospels, exactly. There are some lesser known Gospel which speaks of Christ as a much more, as a much harsher teacher, if you will, as a much harsher Messiah. Lesser known, lesser adopted, therefore had less exposure. Do you know which one that is? Yes. It's the very well known in spiritual circles for its utterly uncompromising stand on the teachings and the messages of Christ. Some of the lines are bewildering. I came here to turn the Father against the Son and the Son against the Father. And statements which, some other statements which are completely bewildering, far from that, the hippie, peace, love, free love, kind of flowers, and very, very uncompromising, very direct. It's like almost like the Christ appears there as that warrior. He has more of the modality of that warrior carrying a sword of discrimination. So this analogy, an example is brought here, because if we can see here that spiritual process in terms of its really uncompromising, like if we look at it in its uncompromising nature, ultimate nature of the process, then it's dissolution of the thought construct, which essentially everything that we know about ourselves, because there is no way of pulling apart a thought construct from the notions about ourselves, because this is cemented together. That's what in the first place arises as this notion of individual identity. That individual identity cannot be cemented unless this Vikalpa supports this limited understanding of me being just this body-mind. And body-mind, in turn, the concept of the body-mind is not separate from all that goes into its making. That's where all the story and where all the narrative supports it all together at all times. Okay, so this is maybe lofty aspirations and lofty concepts, right? But I think it's very important that we at least locate ourselves, orient ourselves, where this work really leads to, what it is aimed at, so that we don't just get kind of arrested at a therapeutic level. And although the therapeutic level of this work is also profound and has its own merit, I would like us to first at least address the ultimate intention, the ultimate aspiration here. And the ultimate aspiration here is that realization that Jiva is Shiva. The realization that this individual soul is in fact totality. And what stands on the way, as we have said just earlier, is that thought construct. So spiritual discourse, spiritual teaching, and again, if we are to lean on the tradition, there are various remedies of how to go about it. And there are classically spoken of ways of, one either has to have exceptionally developed intellect, intellectual capacity to discriminate. So in other words, one of the ways to overcome thought construct is that exceptionally developed intellect, intellectual capacity to discriminate. Another one is to be immersed in the proper teachings, agamas, as they spoken of, scriptures, which again would require commentaries by beings who uncode, often shrouded in metaphor language. And the third one is to find a qualified teacher and learn from the teacher and in the presence of the teacher. These are classically spoken 3 ways of overcoming the thought construct. So now, taking us back to what we spoke earlier before the break, we have this, if you will, stages in the process here. So first stage in the process is actually not directly destruction of Vikalpa, because it's simply impossible. And if some attempts to do that, this may backfire and may bear undesirable consequences. Destruction of the Vikalpa can only really begin when one is introduced to a pure Vikalpa. So in other words, in order to prepare oneself for the proper assault on the thought construct, one needs to have first, as a prerequisite, a proper inference supported by what is known in tradition as Shuddhi Vikalpa, pure thought construct. You see? Because most of our thought construct is impure. From the point of view of spiritual understanding, most of our thought construct is impure. In what account is it impure? It's of no use in terms of what assists us in revealing our own essential nature. It's constantly, in fact, at the mercy of habitual thought. It goes like merry-goes-round, constantly locked in that circle. There are dynamics, there are patterns of how thought construct is upheld by repeated entertainment of certain thoughts, which only set in motion a further circle of repetition of these thoughts. And so it is a locked circle. We think that we're thinking about it in afresh or somehow having a different thought, but it's a wishful thinking. In fact, we are forever locked in that repeated circle of same thoughts, which doesn't for an iota reveal anything. It's a surface movement, therefore it is known as Ashuddhi Vikalpa. Ashuddhi, impure, in Sanskrit, for the benefit. Ashuddhi Vikalpa is essentially mostly our daily thinking. It supports thought construct. So the spiritual, if you will, inquiry or the spiritual process begins with introduction to proper thought. Proper here, pure thought, the thought that is aimed at a later stage, at a later phase of a dissolution of Vikalpa as such. Do you see what we're speaking about here? So in other words, Vikalpa is a culprit. Vikalpa is what obstructs our awareness from knowing itself in all circumstances, from its shining in all circumstances, irrespective of states of mind, states of consciousness. States here we mean in relation to waking, dreaming, deep sleep. It's spoken here in relation to moods, working of our endocrine system, whether we're up or down, it doesn't matter. It shines always. But Vikalpa obstructs this. Therefore, the uncompromising perspective is that dissolution of the Vikalpa is the only solution to rise within, rise as. But in order to move to that, the proper Vikalpa or pure Vikalpas are introduced, these Shuddhi Vikalpas, so as to begin that process of remodeling or rewiring the propensity of our mind to constantly be given to thoughts, which is natural, right? Mind wanders, it is wanders because it's locked or following the pattern of thoughts. Mind, though sattvic in nature, constantly abides in thinking and taking rest only in a deep sleep of state of consciousness when it ceases to do so, or in states of samadhi, in meditation. So in other words, this spiritual discourse and spiritual teaching is what brings the pure Vikalpa. It's, if you will, if you want to give it a different language, right, for a moment, it's culturing the thinking process. Culturing. Before, it's like wild, it's haphazard, it's things, gazillion of things, it's also may go here and there, but as far as the process of verticality, it doesn't bring anything. It keeps our mind bound to the surface level of affairs. So this is with regard to the thought construct and the introduction of spiritual knowledge. So spiritual knowledge has this very specific purpose. So we can't just dismiss spiritual knowledge, that spiritual knowledge itself obviously doesn't lead to liberation. But what it does here, it rewires and replaces the Ashuddhi Vikalpa with Shuddhi Vikalpa. And once that happens, once that takes place, then the dissolution of thought construct is not at the detriment of undesirable consequences of depersonalization and all forms of fears that rise with this, what otherwise will be felt distinctively as the loss of very dear, precious individuality of whom we consider ourselves, because our thought construct is no longer linked to the identity of body and mind, you see? It already starts to experience different vibrations. This is why repeated exposure to proper spiritual discourse is a must. It creates pure Vikalpas. And the creation of the pure Vikalpas obviously begins replacing these Vikalpas which of no use when it comes to this work. So now we have this picture of the stages of the process, from reading the system of accumulated stresses and traumas, of which so much is now being spoken in spiritual communities these days. How to deal with traumas is like a really hot topic, seems to be second year in the going, which obviously, because these impositions in the nervous system, these traumas, these stresses, hold us prisoners to conditioned existence. But this conditioned existence, of course, is not to be blamed on the traumas itself. This is where maybe the field of psychology need to reevaluate of what really is going on, because there is a subtle connection, a pact between thought construct and all this, what we consider to be as the cause of this or that trauma. So in other words, the proper spiritual work finds that thread, pulls it out, which causes the dissolution of that whole thing, rather than going and working with the trauma, working with that lost child or that little child or that whatever that called, right? The inner child. You know, one can work with the inner child for the rest of one's life from that perspective, where one would have to either accept that inner child or reject it or do something with it, love it, transcend it, whereas it's inseparable from the very Vikalpa of this identity. So therefore the work has to take place somewhere else, like a skillful seamstress who knows how that jacket or that shirt or that whatever garment is assembled. If asked to deassemble it, will go and just, cut the thread here and then just pulls it out and the whole thing falls apart. So you see now here that the work, that this process of dissolution and dismantling, process of acquiring the pure Vikalpas, goes all together so as to proceed to the final frontier of offering that limited being on the altar of one's, essentially, of the fire, of that spark of awareness that is lit and awakened, so that this simply, naturally, spontaneously consumes. That fire receives that offering, and that limited sense of self is simply being consummated. It's consumed, not consummated, consumed in that amalgamating flame, so amalgamating light of awareness. And what is restored simply here is natural condition, the natural condition is restored. That what was always there in all circumstances continues to shine forth, but now it shines forth on the account of no longer being abstracted by those seeming frequencies, seeming vibrations that still goes on because they will on their own, but they have no power of abstraction anymore because the light of awareness now shines fully on its own accord in full awareness of itself. So taking us back to the nature of these workshops is that it simultaneously aims at introducing the pure knowledge so as to replace these Vikalpas, which essentially have only use in the mundane reality of life, in the horizontal plane of life, but useless when it comes to the matters of transformation of the soul. And simultaneously, and we cannot say which one is superior and which one is inferior because it goes hand in hand, is that what essentially here, as a place of dissolving these traumas and stresses and freeing the system from anything that is accumulated there, accumulated from birth, accumulated through certain experiences, or just accumulated in the last 2 years, in the last 2 months, whatever. It doesn't matter. Whatever needs to be dealt with immediately being met here, because the frequencies are finer. Soon as the frequencies are finer, then there's a greater possibility for the stresses coming to the surface. The finer vibration is introduced, they cannot coexist there. It's in the nature of the way the nervous system functions. So there are some stresses that have been coagulated, if you will, and they kind of sat for a long time and accumulated and coagulated and sit there deeper, in the deeper recesses. But even then, when the process is stabilized and refined, then even these at some point don't have the chance to remain there because they cause obstruction. And as the nervous system begins to vibrate with finer frequencies, it encounters these stresses because it still stands on the way of that rising of bliss, rising of Ananda, of which we speak more later on. So then we encounter these deeper seated stresses that may have been accumulated since the time we completely forgot of their existence.